Election elation. Democrats enjoy big wins last night. Our team coverage includes a look at how this could impact 2020. Ambush in Mexico. New details in the deaths of 9 Americans at the hands of drug cartels. And building bridges. Pope Francis tells the faithful the best way to reach out to others. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, November 6th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Warning signs for Republicans ahead of 2020. Democrats seize control of Virginia's state house for the first time in more than 2 decades. And the race for Kentucky's governor is still too close to call. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us with an election roundup.
Wyatt, certainly some bad news for Republicans. They continue to lose voters in the suburbs. Now, these off-year state elections are distinct. It doesn't mean these trends will continue into 2020. For one, the Democrats who did win tended to stay away from those controversial issues from the far left, like Medicare for All. Virginia Democrats take over the state house.
I think there were a number of Republican candidates that tried to distance themselves from Trump. A lot of Republican candidates, with their literature, put it out in blue, and they tried to act like they were much more moderate. But I think that overhang from the president's both divisive rhetoric, his unwillingness to compromise, I think it sunk a number of these Republican legislators.
That's despite controversies for Democrats. Pro-lifers accused the governor of supporting infanticide. And his old yearbook photo showed someone in a KKK robe and another in blackface. Today, Virginia Democrats promise a liberal agenda: gun control, a higher minimum wage, and getting rid of abortion restrictions. In Kentucky's governor's race, Democratic challenger Andy Beshear claims victory.
Last night, the election ended. It ended, and it's time to move forward with a smooth transition.
President Trump-backed incumbent Matt Bevin, he still hasn't given up. Bevin challenged Beshear for supporting abortion and focused on his own pro-life views.
It's moral to save a human life. As our founders understood, we were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights that government has no ability or right to take from us because they did not give them to us.
Some Republicans blame the candidate. They say Bevin was just very unpopular. Republicans did win other races in the state, like for Attorney General. And Republicans in Mississippi keep control of the governor's mansion. And one more interesting note, voters in the city of Tucson, Arizona, rejected a proposal to make that city a sanctuary city. Here at the Capitol, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
President Trump is not conceding defeat. He's highlighting the races that Republicans won and says Democrats will lose in 2020. White House correspondent Mark Irons has more. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump thinks the impeachment probe will come back to hurt Democrats at the polls. And though yesterday's election results were mixed, the president is taking credit for helping those Republicans who did win.
This is incredible.
President Trump took to Twitter to share his thoughts, writing, "Won 5 out of 6 elections in Kentucky, including 5 great candidates that I spoke for and introduced."
Kentucky is leading the way.
The president is referring back to Monday night's rally in Kentucky, where he tried to give the Republican candidates a boost. It worked for some, but not Governor Matt Bevin.
This was always going to be a tough race.
Counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, still gives President Trump credit and says other Republican losses in Virginia were not a surprise.
I think Virginia in the last 3 presidential elections voted for Democrats. It's been trending blue for quite a while now, and I don't think they've had a statewide elected Republican there since about 10 years.
I'm standing with President Donald Trump.
The president points to Republican victories. He congratulated Tate Reeves for winning the governor's office in Mississippi, adding, "Friday night moved the numbers from a tie to a big win. Great reaction under pressure, Tate." And at Monday's rally in Kentucky, the president kept up pressure on the Democrats.
And they know they're not going to win in 2020.
The president blames what he calls the impeachment witch hunt.
The American people are fed up with Democrat lies, hoaxes, slander. The Democrats' outrageous conduct has created an angry majority that will vote the do-nothing Democrats the hell out of office soon.
Today, House investigators released another transcript in the impeachment inquiry, the testimony of William Taylor, a top diplomat to Ukraine. Taylor claimed President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine and was going to do so until the country agreed to investigate Democrats and a company linked to Joe Biden's family. Wyatt?
And we'll have more analysis on that a little bit later in the program. White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Laura Echevarria, Director of Communications and Press Secretary at National Right to Life and board member of the Virginia Society for Human Life, joins me now to talk about the election results in that state. Laura, welcome into the program.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Democrats now control both the Senate and the House in Virginia. What's your reaction to last night's results?
Well, last night was devastating for the pro-life community in the state of Virginia. We were hopeful that we would retain control of the House and the Senate. And now with the House and the Senate both going to pro-abortion Democrats, it's going to be an uphill battle. Virginia Society for Human Life and National Right to Life will certainly be paying close attention, and Virginia Society for Human Life will be working on the state level to prevent as much as we can rollbacks of pro-life legislation and pro-life protective measures. But we are looking at the very strong possibility, in fact, the probability that the House and the Senate will vote to pass laws that are very much like those that were the one that was passed in New York State. And Governor Northam has said that he will sign that legislation.
How big a role, when you think about a number of these races, how big a role did pro-abortion groups outside the state of Virginia play in sort of trying to influence that outcome?
Their influence was tremendous. Planned Parenthood, the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League, which is now more commonly known just as NARAL, Pro-Choice America, Emily's List, they were all throwing tremendous amounts of money into these races. The thing that was interesting to see last night, the turnout was not as big as we would have hoped. And certainly we were also starting at a little bit of a deficit. I know in the Senate races, there were Democrats running uncontested in several races. And so that did put us in the negative, even as the polls started, the results were coming in. So these groups were putting millions of dollars into these races, hoping to see Virginia turn blue.
I'm hoping you could expand on a little bit more of what you had said about sort of the policy implications of all of this, because again, for pro-lifers, what do you think is sort of the implications of what they need to do next now that the Democrats are in power, and what do you expect to see first up with the legislative agenda on this, or how soon could Virginians have to face more pro-abortion or pro-abortion legislation to begin with?
I wouldn't be surprised if this was one of the first things that they tried to do. Certainly in the last legislative session, we saw attempts to pass or ratify, rather, the Equal Rights Amendment, which we know from New Mexico's experience that once that is ratified in the state, on the state level, that we end up seeing abortion rights groups come in and pro-abortion groups come in and try to remove all protective legislation in the state. If this were passed in Virginia, if it were ratified in Virginia, then we're looking at what kind of impact will that have on the Equal Rights Amendment nationally, because there are some legal scholars who argue that Virginia would be the last state to ratify a constitutional amendment, a U.S. constitutional amendment, that would be the Equal Rights Amendment, and it would be considered the last state to do so, like I said, by some legal scholars. So there would be a debate over whether or not that would be the last required state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. We were also looking at legislation like what Delegate Tran tried to pass in this last legislative session, which would allow abortions up through the moment of birth. And so that's the kind of legislation that we can expect pro-abortion Democrats to put forward.
A lot of concerns there for sure for pro-lifers, and obviously a reminder of how important it is that pro-lifers in Virginia continue to speak out.
Yes.
Laura Echevarria, Director of Communications and Press Secretary at the National Right to Life and board member at the Virginia Society for Human Life, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
House Democrats say public hearings in the impeachment investigation into President Donald Trump will begin next week. Representative Adam Schiff made the announcement earlier today. He says the testimony will feature 3 State Department officials who expressed concerns about President Trump's dealings with Ukraine. The president has denied any wrongdoing. A federal judge in New York has struck down a Trump administration provision allowing healthcare workers to opt out of providing abortions on moral or religious grounds. The decision came after several organizations, including some pro-abortion groups, sued the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They say the rule is unconstitutional. Mexico's foreign minister says the drug cartel gunman who killed 9 Americans will be brought to justice.
El presidente López Obrador le llamó para, en primer lugar, darle las condolencias de parte del pueblo de México.
Marcelo Ebrard says his country's president has spoken to President Trump about the killings. The foreign minister spoke from the site of the murders in the northern part of the country. 6 children and 3 women were killed after their cars were attacked. A family member in Utah says one of the women died protecting her infant daughter. 8 other children survived the ambush. 3 were unharmed. The others were taken to a hospital on the U.S.-Mexico border. Catholic bishops in Bolivia are calling for more transparency in the country's disputed presidential election. They say there are signs of fraud in the voting that showed Evo Morales had won a 4th term. There were more protests this morning in the capital of La Paz. Sporadic and intense demonstrations have gripped the country following the election last month. Morales accuses the opposition of staging a coup against him. A cardinal in Venezuela says if President Nicolas Maduro loves his country, he would have already left office. Cardinal Jorge Liberato Llorosa Savino also says Maduro has led the country to a terrible ruin, and the problems are becoming worse. Maduro's socialist government has been marred by severe inflation and a lack of basic needs like water, food, and medicine. Catholic bishops in Kenya have launched a 6-month anti-corruption campaign. The bishops say they will not accept donations in cash, and they will avoid all funding from what they believe to be dubious origins. The bishops say corruption is a rotting of the heart. We're learning more about the investigation into the Vatican Bank. Several church officials in Rome say Cardinal George Pell had objected to a $55 million loan request in 2014 for the Vatican to purchase a bankrupt hospital. The request later was granted by the Holy See Central Bank, and it violated international regulations. At the time, Cardinal Pell was in charge of reforming the Vatican's finances. Coming up, analysis of last night's election results in Kentucky and Virginia. The White House marks what it calls a historic milestone. Today, President Trump noting he has filled more than 150 judicial openings.
And they will uphold our Constitution as written. These distinguished men and women are some of the most gifted scholars, respected jurists, and finest legal minds ever placed on the federal bench.
President Trump has worked with Congress to confirm 112 judges to federal district courts and 43 judges to federal circuit courts. But he's most proud of the 2 new justices on the Supreme Court. The administration says it's on track to have more judges confirmed this year than the previous 2 years combined. With the start of public hearings in the House impeachment inquiry just 1 week away, Democrats today released hundreds of pages of testimony from one of the first witnesses called to appear. William Taylor, a top diplomat to Ukraine, testified behind closed doors last month for more than 10 hours. Taylor told impeachment investigators it was his clear understanding the U.S. government intended to withhold military aid from Ukraine until the country committed to investigations sought by President Donald Trump. President Trump maintains he did nothing wrong. Joining me now to offer his analysis is Matthew Continetti, founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon. Matthew, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Republicans have been looking for transparency throughout this whole process. What do you think they'll be looking for as we get all of this underway with open hearings, or at least we're hoping publicly open hearings next week?
Well, with public hearings, it may be dangerous for the Democrats because Republicans will have an opportunity to present their case to the public as well, which is something they've been unable to do because up to this point the process has been so tightly controlled by Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi.
There have been numerous calls for the whistleblower's identity to be revealed, the one who had sort of kicked all of this off, including from President Trump himself. Now, some people say it's not necessary to have that whistleblower come out and reveal his identity to the public. Others say it's very important because obviously it's important to get his name, his testimony out. What's your reaction to the 2 different sides of this?
I've actually been a little bit surprised that we haven't learned the identity of the whistleblower. yet. I mean, there are names being floated in the online press, but the mainstream media has not gone ahead and identified the whistleblower. I'd be shocked if we don't eventually know who the whistleblower is. I believe at the rally the other night in Kentucky, Rand Paul threatened to name the whistleblower at any time. And given President Trump's Twitter habits and such, maybe one day we'll know the identity. And the identity is important to the Trump case, because what the Trump defense will be is that this is all a political setup, basically orchestrated by his enemies, both inside the administration and out.
Turning now to last night's elections, is it too soon to know if the impeachment resonated with voters?
Well, the polling we have from last week suggests that impeachment is much less popular in swing states than it is nationwide. I don't know how big of an issue it was in the election in Kentucky or the election in Virginia or the election in Mississippi. It seems that local issues and then just the broader issue of President Trump generally mattered much more.
Only a few states went to the polls yesterday, but are there any common threads that stick out to you, especially as we look ahead to 2020?
Well, we do see weakness among Republicans in suburban areas, and that includes in all of the states that went to the polls, including places like Pennsylvania that are critical to President Trump's re-election. So what that tells me is that the environment today in 2019 is more like that in 2018, last year, when the Democrats took the House of Representatives, than in 2016. So I think Republicans and President Trump have work to do in the suburbs if they want to win a second term.
Democrats obviously are encouraged by the results in Virginia. They now control both chambers of the state legislature there. Does that turnover surprise you?
Not really. As a native Virginian, I've kind of had a front row seat to the political transformation of my state. What's fascinating is over 20 years, as Northern Virginia in particular has become higher educated, has higher levels of immigration, has higher construction and density and all that traffic we complain about in the DMZ, it's become more democratic. This is a trend you see in states from California to Colorado and now Virginia. I don't think there's any going back anytime soon.
Okay, so many important issues that we'll continue to follow. Matthew Continetti, founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Democratic presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren is dropped from a lawsuit by 10 students from Covington Catholic High School in Kentucky. The Massachusetts senator was named in the libel suit for saying the Native American at the center of the incident endured hateful taunts with dignity and strength. A judge says Warren acted appropriately. The incident occurred in January while the students were attending the March for Life. A bishop in Minnesota says he kept an admitted child abuser in active ministry. In a deposition released yesterday, Bishop Michael Heppner of the Diocese of Crookston says he mishandled several cases of misconduct. One involved a priest who said as a teenager he had abused a child. Bishop Heppner is the subject of a Vatican investigation into his administration of the diocese. For more on the story, including a closer look at the allegations against Bishop Heppner, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Up next, Pope Francis releases his prayer intention for November. And the Holy Father recognizes the efforts of a Canadian couple fighting on behalf of those with mental health disorders.
En el Próximo Oriente, la convivencia y el diálogo entre las tres religiones monoteístas.
Pope Francis says his prayer intention for November is for an increase of dialogue among the religions in the Middle East. The Holy Father says Christians with Jewish and Muslim communities can work together for peace and forgiveness. The Holy Father also spoke about interreligious dialogue during his weekly talk with pilgrims at the Vatican.
La mano tesa, niente aggressione.
Pope Francis says the faithful can build bridges instead of aggression. All they have to do is ask for help from the Holy Spirit. The Holy Father also says reaching out to others, especially those of different faiths, can touch even the most hardened hearts. The Pope greets a Canadian couple who advocates for people who struggle with mental health issues. The Holy Father greeted Dr. Austin Mardon and his wife Catherine today. They have helped people with issues like schizophrenia for almost 3 decades. The couple has also written several books on the topic, including a children's series that has been translated into 18 languages. Dr. Austin Mardon is an adjunct professor for the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Alberta in Canada. He joins us now from Rome. Dr. Mardon, many people struggle with schizophrenia. I know you yourself were diagnosed almost 30 years ago. How do you help those who have this diagnosis?
Well, the first thing is that previous generations didn't have access to appropriate medications, that in the mid-1990s, a whole new class of series of medications started coming on the market that can make management of schizophrenia pretty awesome. You might not get cured. You still have some of the symptoms and you still have to take the meds for the rest of your life. But compared to, I know what it was like for my mother 50 years ago, it's a world of difference in terms of the medication. And also, you know, the other thing that helps is fighting stigma against mental illness. There are approximately 10 million Catholics in the world with schizophrenia, and approximately 50 to 70 million people total in the world that have schizophrenia. It affects 1% of the population amongst all classes, genders, and nationalities.
It seems like it's so important that you were there to meet with Pope Francis this morning. What was it like to meet him? What was your reaction?
Well, it was very emotional. I didn't sleep last night. Many in our faith community, many outside, suffer in silence and suffer a lot of stigma, self-stigma, and loathing and fear by societies all around the world to varying degrees. And you know, to have the pontiff actually meet and allow me to kiss his ring, and my wife, who doesn't suffer from schizophrenia but has her own physical disabilities, to also allow her is a great significance.
Dr. Mardon, in general, how do government officials support mental illness, and what more can governments do?
Well, I mean, each individual society and government has different attitudes, has different policies related to the treatment of serious mental illness. I mean, mental illness affects at least 20% to 25% of the world's population, but schizophrenia is probably one of the worst ones in terms of severity. So it's a real health crisis all over the world, and many health authorities realize that, and it strains their budgets. It's very difficult to deal with. Many people with schizophrenia are incarcerated due to get involved in the criminal justice system, are homeless. Many are homeless. The majority of the homeless population in my home city are psychotic or schizophrenic, and it's a very difficult illness to deal with in its acute stage. And but when it can get under treatment, and when people access the treatments available, the medications and the stuff like cognitive behavioral therapy, they can live lives that are pretty normal. Maybe not as normal as their parents would want or society wants, but they can be very upstanding citizens.
Well, mental illness is such an important issue, and so we're very happy to highlight that issue. Dr. Austin Mardon, adjunct professor for the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Alberta. Thank you so much. And Dr. Mardon also told me that he encourages anyone with mental health problems to seek professional help if you're able to. And with that, we conclude our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.